Well, good morning, everybody. I am up and at 'em early this morning. Our boys play their first round in the state tournament this morning at 9:30, and it takes me about an hour, 15 minutes to get where they're going or where they're playing. So I am up early this morning. And before I start, I wanted to take an opportunity. I was thinking about this last night. When I started this channel 2 months ago, whatever it was, it's in January sometime. If you ever checked out my first video, my intro video, I explained kind of why I started this and how my wife had been after me for years to do this. And I always told her no one would watch. There's too many other people out there that the market is saturated with JFK researchers and people talking about JFK. And I have been shocked. I can't believe all the people that watch and respond and comment and so it's been a real shot in the arm for me. I kind of thought I was John the Baptist out there in the wilderness, and and I don't make any claims to be the greatest JFK researcher ever come down the pike. I couldn't hold the you know Jim Mars, guys like him. They're just, it's just unbelievable to be included in a very, very small way with a group of people that have laid so much on the line to try to bring truth to the American people. I'm just doing a very, very small part. And I'm just humbled and grateful that people care enough to watch and listen. And it kind of reinforces my faith in the American people and our country going forward. That truth still does matter. So shout out to all of you guys. Thank you. As usual, my name is Barry Jones, and I am with Standards Plus History Academy. My website is sphistory.com if you're interested. And today we are wrapping up investigation number 3, which is the Watergate investigation. I always conclude with a look at some of the victims during the period of that particular investigation. We've already looked at the victims in the Warren Commission, which you can see is pretty high spike in unexplained, unnatural, very suspicious deaths of key people. And then we looked at the end of that decade with the Garrison Shaw trial, and there was a spike there. And of course, some pretty important people to Garrison's case died like within days of the case being started. And now we're looking at the Watergate case, which is 72 to 74, roughly. And the question I ask, you can see the circle there. This is the period that we're looking at. I reach back to 71 and I go forward to 75. So about a 4-year span there. And the question I always ask, it's the same question I asked in the previous Culture of Death episodes. If Watergate was just political dirty tricks, which is sort of the public narrative, Nixon dirtying up the opposition, spying on the opposition. If that's all it was, why is there so much collateral damage? That's a political scandal. They were caught red-handed. Um, that's doesn't rise to the level. You can understand an assassination, but even then, if it was just what they say it was, just Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, it doesn't explain all these deaths of all these other people, these periphery people. So I'm going to go through I've arranged it in timeline form, and I'm just going to go through a laundry list and tell you some stories today. I hope that's okay. So February 1972, this is prior to the break-in. Remember, the break-in was June 17th, 72. Two men, James Webster and James Glover, who both work in Congressman William Mills' campaign from Maryland. You see a picture here of Congressman Mills. I could not find any pictures of Webster and Glover. So that's what we'll have to do, Congressman Mills, and he's going to come up again later. According to a campaign worker on Mills's staff, there was a $25,000 contribution from CREEP, which we know is the Committee to Re-elect the President, to Congressman Mills, which was delivered to James Webster. And both men, Webster and Glover, were killed in a car accident. All right, I'm not going to editorialize too much. I'm just going to go through a list, and then when we get to the end, I think you're going to see a pattern here. So that's James Webster and James and Glover. How about this one? People should recognize this name. J. Edgar Hoover, May 1st, 1972. So this is getting closer to D-Day, the burglary. Obviously, he's the FBI director. And there's just reams of evidence that Hoover knew about the White House dirty tricks operation. Hoover knew everything. Okay. There isn't anything Hoover didn't know. It was going down in Washington. Interesting revelation by Felipe de Diego. Now, I had mentioned before, we've talked about the plumbers a lot, and we always reference the 5 burglars and the 2 lookouts. But I had mentioned before in an earlier episode that there were others who were involved with the plumbers. It just wasn't these 5. These were the 5 that got arrested and the 2 lookouts. According to Felipe de Diego, he was also a plumber, participated in other missions. He was a Cuban exile, and he was involved in the plumber's burglary of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist office, which was one of the very first operations. So he was with them from the start. He was one of those guys recruited by E. Howard Hunt. According to him, he says, quote, 2 burglaries took place at Hoover's D.C. home. The first was in the winter of 1972 to retrieve documents that might be used for blackmail against Nixon. After the first burglary, a second burglary was carried out, this time, whether by design or misunderstanding, a poison, thion phosphate genre, I may be mispronouncing that, was placed in Hoover's personal toilet articles. Hoover died shortly after that. Thion phosphate genre is a drug that induces heart seizures. And you can't detect it without an autopsy in a person, in a body. And as we know, with J. Edgar Hoover, there was no autopsy ever performed on Hoover. And Hoover died in his sleep. His death was attributed to heart disease. So he wasn't that old either. He was 77 when he died, as you see there by that article there. So, wow, what a revelation. And according to him, in the winter of 72, so that could be like January, February, leading up to maybe March. In Washington, D.C., it'd still be winter in March. They broke into his home and they planted this drug, and it kills you. It induces a heart seizure. And according to him, Hoover died shortly thereafter, and there was no autopsy, and the cause of death was heart disease. Very, very interesting. July of 72, so this is after the burglary, about a month. Hale Boggs, a congressman from Louisiana, who during the years 63 to 64 was a member of the Warren Commission. We've spoken a lot about the Warren Commission. And I did mention earlier that the Warren Commission was not unanimous. They all signed it, but several of them had doubts. In fact, the case could be made, 4 of the 7 had doubts, but it was rammed through anyway. primarily by Allen Dulles. So Boggs was one of them that had doubts. He had doubts that JFK and J.D. Tippit had been killed by Oswald, and that Jack Ruby was not part of any conspiracy. Two of the findings of the Warren Commission, according to Bernard Fensterwald, quote, almost from the beginning, Congressman Boggs had been suspicious over the FBI and CIA's reluctance to provide hard information when the commission's probe turned to certain areas, such as allegations that Oswald may have been an undercover operative of some sort. When the commission sought to disprove the growing suspicion that Oswald had once worked for the FBI, Boggs was outraged. The only proof of denial that the FBI offered was a brief statement of disclaimer by J. Edgar Hoover. In other words, Boggs was very suspicious of Allen Dulles primarily because he suspected that Oswald, and others did as well, was CIA. And he couldn't get any information on the FBI and the CIA related to that. So they just stuck their head in the sand. No, he was never a member of the CIA. No, he was never an FBI informant. That changes considerably. The fact that he was both, that changes the calculus of this entire issue, this entire matter. So anyway, Fensterwald said Boggs had doubts from the beginning. According to John Judge, who is one of those JFK researchers, kind of like Jim Mars and others, it was Boggs who asked Dulles in a meeting about releasing evidence publicly, and Dulles replied, quote, go ahead and print it. Nobody will read it anyway. And that was confirmed as Dulles's view about the American people. We can print this 888-page book. No one's going to read it, which means we can say anything. According to one of his friends, Hale felt very, very torn during his work on the commission. He wished he'd never been on it and wished he'd never signed it. Another former aide argued that, quote, Hale always returned to one thing, and this is key right here. Hoover lied his eyes out to the commission on Oswald, on Ruby, on their friends, the bullets, the gun, you name it. And of course, we've already established the fact that the Warren Commission did not examine one piece of evidence that did not come filtered through the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover, within minutes of the assassination and within a day, had already issued his memo declaring that JFK was killed by a lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. So he concluded what the Warren Commission later concluded because he controlled the evidence. According to Hale, Hoover lied his eyes out on everything. Anyway, 7 days after the Watergate break-in, so now we're fast forwarding to June of 72, Nixon made some unintelligible remarks about Congressman Boggs, which were later heard on the tapes. So in real time, a week after the Watergate break-in, Nixon, for some reason, is talking about Congressman Boggs. 1 month after the Watergate break-in, Boggs presumably died when he and two other men disappeared in an aircraft in which they were flying. It disappeared over Alaska. It was never seen again. They never recovered the bodies. They never found the plane. It was just gone. By the way, just an interesting factoid. The man who was Hale Boggs' ride to the airport that day was a young Bill Clinton. Just throw that in for kicks and giggles. On November 22, 1973, so this is about 6 months later, the Los Angeles Star reported that, quote, Boggs had startling revelations on Watergate and the assassination of President Kennedy. Very, very interesting. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's so definitive, the links between the Watergate scandal and the JFK assassination. A man like Congressman Boggs obviously had discovered some links. had some startling revelations to make. But he couldn't make them publicly because he was dead. All right, December 8th, 1972. Some of you have asked me about this lady. Her name is Dorothy Hunt, pictured here with her husband, E. Howard Hunt, who is just, the more you study this case, the more you realize E. Howard Hunt is just, like Nixon said, the lever, the key. We're going to talk next about the church hearings and all the operations that the CIA had been involved in, like Operation Mockingbird and the Phoenix Pro. He was involved in all of them. He's ever present. It's unreal. Anyway, turns out his wife, Dorothy, also worked for the CIA as an operative in China and France. So I imagine this was one happy family. After Watergate, the Hunts played hardball with the White House, and they began blackmailing the White House. And Hunt, E. Howard Hunt, a lot of the blackmail was communicated, the terms were communicated through Dorothy to the powers that be. Dorothy, in that capacity, told Charles Colson, who was the White House special counsel, quote, "If Nixon doesn't pay heavy to suppress the documents that we have showing he is implicated in the planning and carrying out by the FBI and the CIA of the political murder of President Kennedy, we will blow the White House out of the water." You talk about smoking gun. This is E. Howard Hunt's wife saying, "We have the goods on you," going back to the planning and carrying out by the FBI and the CIA of the political murder of President Kennedy. This is why when Nixon is told by Dean it's going to take $1 million to keep these burglars quiet, Nixon's like, that's easy. I got the cash. I know where you can get the cash. He was eager to pay E. Howard Hunt and the other burglars, but especially E. Howard Hunt. Hush money. E. Howard Hunt, as we have learned, came to have a crisis of conscience later in life, and hence his deathbed confession, which thankfully he made. You can see his conscience starting to bother him as he ages. He says here, "May God have mercy on my soul for the deaths on my name and for the treachery I committed, betrayal of God and country." What a sad and horrible thing it is. By the way, his alias to all of his charges in the anti-Castro community was always Eduardo. Eduardo. That's how they knew him. This is the quote I teased you with yesterday and said that this is going to put a nail in the, I think, in the coffin of the lone gunman theory. And it references the 18.5-minute gap in the White House tape, which I have already told you that story. Santos Trafficante told the story. But here is some corroboration in case you need it. In real time, on June 21st, 1972, this is 4 days after the break-in, Nixon is talking to Dean regarding Hunt and all the burglars. And he says, quote, "You have to keep investigators away from this. We got to get this shut off. We've got to shut this investigation down because, quote, this involves a covert operation that happened a long time ago. I was involved in it, and it involves these Bay of Pigs guys that were in the Watergate Hotel. It was an extremely sensitive operation, something different than the Bay of Pigs invasion itself. It's a deep and serious problem, and you have to do everything you can to keep this information from coming out." Now, when Dean was asked, if you remember, about this 18.5-minute gap, he claims he forgot what he and Nixon were discussing. But the reason we know what he was discussing is because the FBI had wiretapped Dean's lawyer's office. And when Dean got himself in legal jeopardy, he, like Santos Trafficante to his lawyer, unburdened himself and told his lawyer everything that Nixon said in that 18 and a half minutes. So we have from two different sources what was said during that 18 and a half minutes. And what was said was Nixon telling the story of how he recruited Howard Dean and Robert Mayhew and the mob, Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana, Carlos Marcello, and Johnny Rosselli was involved, and Mr. Sheffield Edwards was involved. And together they all put the S-Force together. And this S-Force trained in Mexico, was paid by a skim off the casinos. Cash was laundered by Meyer Lansky to a bank in Mexico City, Banco Internacional, to an account owned by Manuel Aguirre. This is how they were paid. They trained at Clint Murchison Ranch down in Mexico. It was all to kill Castro from distance with high-powered rifles and scopes on a moving target. And when that didn't happen, obviously what happens is the S-Force changes its target, targets Kennedy instead, kills him using that training, high-powered rifles with scopes, moving target from distance. All those different S-Force members that were in Dallas, same S-Force members that were at Watergate, he calls them the Bay of Pigs guys. And of course, we already know what he considers to be the Bay of Pigs. That's the JFK assassination. So essentially what he's saying here is, this involves a covert operation that happened a long time ago. I was involved in it. It involves these JFK assassination guys that were caught at the Watergate Hotel. It was an extremely sensitive operation, something different than the Bay of Pigs invasion itself. It's a deep and serious problem. You have to do everything you can to keep this information from coming out. My God, there you go. There you go. That's why Nixon was covering up. This has nothing to do with Watergate. All right, back to Dorothy Hunt. So last we talked about her, she's blackmailing. She and her husband are blackmailing the White House. 6 months after Watergate, Dorothy boarded United Airlines Flight 533, going from D.C. to Chicago, and she's with somebody. Her name is Michelle Clark. She's a CBS reporter. Hunt was planning to go public. What had happened was 6 months had gone by, and the White House was starting to resist making any more cash payments. Dorothy and her husband, E. Howard Hunt, kept raising the price. And at some point, the White House cut them off. And so she says, fine, you want to cut me off? I am going to go public with evidence of Nixon's involvement in Watergate and the JFK assassination. I'm going with Michelle Clark. We're going to do a press conference. It's going to be the mother of all press conferences in Chicago. She also had, turns out she was the paymaster, all this cash that the White House was paying, hush money, she was using to distribute to all the burglars. Obviously, she kept a good portion for herself and her husband, but then she would pay these other burglars to keep quiet. She was also paying people like Michael Stevens, who owned Stevens Research Labs in Chicago, from whom she had secured some of the surveillance equipment that the plumbers had used. She was going to pay him. She had, when she was found in her personal belongings, she had $100,000 cash on her in $100 bills. Does it sound familiar? Anyway, before she could get to Chicago, there was a very suspicious plane crash. Everybody died. Immediately, sabotage of the plane was suspected. But before the NTSB or any of the normal channels could get to Chicago to investigate the plane crash, the FBI cordoned off the area. I read one account where the FBI cars were already parked in the neighborhood where the plane went down. They were sitting there waiting. And when the plane went down, they hurried up, secured the scene, and went through the wreckage to get the evidence that they wanted. This was before anybody official, this is a crime. This is a secure area. You're not supposed to be, and that's not the FBI's purview anyway. On December 8th, 1972, the day after the crash, White House aide, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, Eagle Krog, whatever, was appointed Undersecretary of Transportation, which means he is supervising the NTSB and the Federal Aviation Association. These are the two agencies that investigate this crash. You can see this crash happen in a residential area. So not just people on the plane died, people on the ground died. 1 week later, Nixon's deputy assistant, Alexander Butterfield, was made new head of the FAA. And 5 weeks later, Nixon's appointment secretary, Dwight Chapin, was sent to Chicago to become a top executive with United Airlines, the airline that went down. And of course, the crash was ultimately blamed on equipment failure. Wow. So you've got a suspicious plane crash with a person on board who's about ready to bust open two of the biggest scandals in the history of our country. Very suspicious case. And she's got all this money on her, cash, that she's going to pay Michael Stevens. She's on board with a reporter. The FBI is waiting for the plane to go down, there before anybody, disappears before anybody can get there. Who knows what they took? And then all of the bodies responsible for investigating this, including the head of the United Airlines going forward, are all replaced. All those heads of those people are all replaced by White House people before the report comes out. My goodness. We find out that Dorothy Hunt was not the only person on that plane that had incriminating information about Nixon and the White House. Same day, December 8th, 1972, an attorney for Northern Natural Gas named Ralph Blodgett possessed documents that linked John Mitchell, who we know as the committee to re-elect the president chairman, to Watergate and a secret transfer of El Paso Natural Gas Company stock to Mitchell after the Justice Department. Remember, he was previously the Attorney General. After the Justice Department, which he would be over, dropped a $300 million antitrust lawsuit against the El Paso company. Allegedly, the money from these stocks all got funneled into a Nixon slush fund, and this guy had the documents. So in other words, there was a $300 million lawsuit against El Paso Natural Gas Company that got dropped. The lawsuit just got dropped by John Mitchell. And then John Mitchell, as committee to re-elect the president chairman, took the stock that was given to him by this company, presumably as a bribe, and he funneled it into a Nixon slush fund. And this guy has the documents. Turns out Blodgett was on the same plane with Dorothy Hunt. Blodgett suspected something was going to happen to him. He told his friend before he got on that plane, quote, he would never live to get to Chicago. And he was right. December 27th, 1972. This was, we talked about it briefly, the biggest scandal. The ITT affair was the biggest scandal in the Nixon administration until Watergate. And it was busted. The story was busted by Jack Anderson. Who else? Richard Lavoie was chief of security for International Telegraph and Telephone, ITT. The time of his death on December 27th, 2 days after Christmas, Lavoie was guarding a woman named Dita Beard, an ITT secretary who said she had a memo that her company had given 400 grand to Nixon's campaign fund. for the same purposes of what we just learned with Ralph Blodgett. Why? So that John Mitchell would not bust up some of ITT's holdings. John Mitchell was the Attorney General, which means he's over the Justice Department. So this is another bribe. John Mitchell is being used by Nixon in his capacity as Attorney General to threaten lawsuits against companies. And then in order to settle those lawsuits or drop those lawsuits, you can pay up. And as chairman of the committee to re-elect the president, Mitchell takes the bribe and funnels it to Nixon and the committee to re-elect. So Jack Anderson breaks this story, turns into a big deal. Miss Beard, who says she has the memo, was moved from DC to Denver, Colorado, where she was hospitalized for an apparent heart attack. According to Anderson, though, she was whisked away, so she couldn't testify. She just disappeared. Lavoie, after this episode passed, Lavoie died of a heart attack, an apparent heart attack, shortly thereafter. December 27th, 1972. How about James Morton? Morton was President Ford's campaign treasurer. I think what we're starting to see here is that the corruption runs deep. Because now we're on Ford. November 2, 1973, according to the New York Times, Ford was being questioned by a Senate committee. This is before he got appointed VP. And there was a $38,000 campaign contribution that was secret that had been made to him in his campaign for re-election to the House of Representatives. So they're asking about this $38,000 secret campaign contribution. And according to the New York Times, Ford confirmed that the $216 did exist. There was a contribution of that amount. He said it was from a committee organized in DC for his benefit. This was for his re-election in 1972. But Ford said, I don't know who it was. I don't know who the donors were, because the treasurer, James Morton, is now dead. And when the New York Times checked on James Morton, they found that his death had been ruled by, quote, unknown causes. All right, May 24th, 1973. I told you William Mills, the congressman from Maryland, would come up again. Here he is. And it goes back to that same contribution again from Creep, $25,000 from Nixon's Creep. So this is obviously a Nixon guy. If you're getting money from Creep, you're a Nixon guy. According to reports, the 25 grand came from the $1.7 million secret fund for dirty tricks used by Creep. I think by now you should be getting the picture how this slush fund was funded. John Mitchell was using his position as over the Justice Department's Attorney General, to extort money from companies. And he was putting that money in Creep. And we've already learned that Howard Hughes was contributing money to Nixon's slush fund as well. So there are no shortages of income streams for this slush fund. So Nixon's handing out money. Actually, Mitchell's doing it on his behalf, like candy. He's like Santa Claus. He's the biggest sugar daddy in Washington. Anyway, William Mills was found shot to death. One day after it was disclosed that he failed to report this $25,000 campaign contribution. Now, remember now, there's 3 people that know about this campaign contribution. They're all dead. The 2 campaign workers in the car crash, and now the congressman himself. This death was ruled a suicide. They found Mills with a 12-gauge shotgun by his feet and a suicide note pinned to his chest. As they continued to search the surrounding area, they found 6 more suicide notes in his home. Oh my goodness. J. Clifford Dietrich. This is kind of an interesting little thing. He was a young guy, 28-year-old Secret Service agent, who was personally assigned to Nixon. In other words, he followed Nixon around everywhere he went. And in May of '73, the president's helicopter crashed off the Bahamas. Obviously, Nixon wasn't on board, but 7 people were on board, and the only one who died was Dietrich. So some suspicion that Dietrich, in his capacity as being so close to the president all the time, had information that was incriminating or damaging to Nixon. The crash was relatively minor. That's why the other 6 survived, all except Clifford Dietrich. He was the only one on board, by the way, that had that access to Nixon. How about George Bell, June 30, 1973? You can see we're just kind of chronologically moving along here. He was the assistant to Charles Colson, special counsel to the White House. When questioned by the House subcommittee looking into Watergate, they were asking about Nixon and his famous or his infamous enemies list. Colson said, quote, "The late George Bell was responsible for the list of 200 celebrities and politicians whom the president considered dangerous." The late George Bell. I would like to tell you about the enemies list, but I can't because the man who compiled it, was in charge of it, is dead. And of course, his death was ruled by unknown causes, June 30, 1973. November 73, Jack Cleveland, a partner of Richard Nixon's brother, Donald Nixon. If you viewed or listened to my episodes about Howard Hughes and Nixon, you know that Howard Hughes made a $205,000 loan to Donald Nixon. And even though the venture failed, the Nixon burger and the hamburger joint, Hughes didn't bat an eyelash. He's like, that wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to get access to Richard Nixon, to create a partnership, which is what he did. Anyway, Jack Cleveland was wanted for questioning in connection with a possible government payoff to Howard Hughes. We went through quite a few payoffs that Howard Hughes received, some of them from John Mitchell, ironically, and the Justice Department, dropping lawsuits or paving the way so he could buy airlines. And Howard Hughes always understood how the game was played. You get me what I want, I'll give you what you want. So Cleveland, who was a partner of Donald Nixon, is wanted for questioning connection with a possible government payout to Howard Hughes. It was suspected that Cleveland was a go-between in a deal between that resulted in Donald Nixon getting an interest in a large ranch in Nevada in exchange for the president clearing the way for Hughes' purchase of Air West. I don't know what else you could say about this. Obviously, Hughes wanted to purchase Air West. The government was fighting him on it. They thought it would make he would have a monopoly. They were going to bust it up. They weren't going to let him purchase Air West. But the president clears the way in exchange for money and interest in a large Nevada ranch. Jack Cleveland is the go-between. Oh, but before you can question him, he dies in Canada of unknown causes. Beverly Kaye, 1973, December. She is the secretary for the Secret Service agent named John Bull. Her job as secretary for this particular agent was to store and preserve the White House tapes. She was involved with that. It makes you wonder who John Bull was, because we learned yesterday that the CIA infiltrated the Secret Service that was responsible for administering and maintaining the White House tapes with their own people. And Here we see John Bull, Secret Service agent, and his job is to store and preserve the White House tapes. Anyway, she's his secretary. According to Bull, I've put an extra word in there, evidently. I need to take that out. Anyway, according to Bull, it is almost without question, quote, that she knew what was on those tapes, including the 18 minutes of recorded conversation, which were mysteriously erased. At age 42, Miss Beverly Kaye, before she could be questioned about this, died of a massive stroke. Here you see a newspaper article indicating there was suspicion about her death right away. All right, now we are in 74. Lee Pennington Jr., pictured here next to, I think that is J. Edgar Hoover. He is with on his left. Anyway, he is a CIA agent who was, after the Watergate arrest, he was sent to the burglar James McCord's home. This was a fact that was hidden from all investigators looking into Watergate by, of course, CIA Director Richard Helms. So Helms sent him, and Helms kept it to himself, didn't tell anybody. Well, on June 28, 1974, we learn about this because new CIA Director William Colby and Schlesinger are the two CIA directors who handed over the family jewels to the church committee and came under withering criticism from the CIA people who wanted to keep all their covert operations covert. They were furious with Colby and Schlesinger for doing this. So you kind of see two CIA directors, Colby and Schlesinger, who recognized that the CIA had gone rogue and they were both interested in cleaning it up. So they turned over the documents and say, hey, it's going to be unpleasant, but we got to go through this. And of course, they were very much in the minority, that opinion. Anyway, William Colby reported to Senator Howard Baker in 1974 on this day, quote, the results of our investigation clearly show that the CIA had in its possession, as early as June 72, information that one of its paid operatives, Lee Pennington Jr., had entered the James McCord residence shortly after the Watergate break-in and destroyed documents which might show a link between McCord and the CIA, which we ended up finding out later anyway. Pennington died in October of 74 of an apparent heart attack. Murray Chotiner. If you're familiar with Nixon, you know who Murray Chotiner is. January 23, 1974. This was a close Nixon advisor. He was a political strategist. He was an attorney for Nixon at different points. He was a friend. A lot of dirty work Murray Chotiner did on behalf of Richard Nixon. According to a March 31, 1973 article in the LA Times, Chotiner was one of the people who received the tape recordings that were made inside DNC headquarters in the Watergate building. If you remember, we talked about this yesterday. The CIA had infiltrated 3 orbits of Nixon. They had infiltrated the White House with E. Howard Hunt, the Secret Service who handled the tapes. They're in the White House with their 2 agents. Also, they had infiltrated the committee to re-elect the president with James McCord as security director. And then the plumbers with McCord and Hunt and Eugenio Martinez, and they knew everything that was going on. And remember, when they were planning all these bugs, McCord was simultaneously planning 2 sets of bugs, one set for the plumbers and one set for the CIA. And they would, the tapes that they received, the information, the intelligence they received from the tapes set for the CIA, they would keep, and the information from the bugs, the plumbers, they hand over to the plumbers, and the information The bugs that were set for the plumbers were in locations that netted them nothing, and the bugs that were set for the CIA were in places that netted them everything. And so this is why Nixon complained later to Charles Colson, I don't think we got a goddamn thing from all that spying. We get anything from it. Well, this is why. The bugging was rigged by James McCord. Anyway, Chotiner was receiving tape recordings made inside DNC headquarters in the Watergate building. And there's no indication of which recordings he was receiving. As a Nixon insider, I would presume he was receiving the cleansed recordings, the recordings that were of little value. But the fact is, he had them. He was killed on January 23, 1974, before all of the tapes were released and the evidence came out, and Nixon was forced to resign. A government truck T-boned his car. It was initially reported as a minor accident. They said Chotiner broke his leg. A week later, he dies. Never left the hospital. August 16th, 1974. Clay Shaw. There's a name that should ring a bell. Remember, he was indicted by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison for his alleged participation in a conspiracy to kill JFK, and he was acquitted. Remember, this is the trial where all the important witnesses died. And this was the trial where he got on the stand and lied his butt off about being in the CIA. No, never in the CIA. Don't know what you're talking about. Victor Marchetti wrote a book called The Cult of Intelligence, where he proved with documents that not only was Clay Shaw CIA, he was their man. He was the CIA's man in New Orleans and had been on missions in Mexico in 1963 at the same time. E. Howard Hunt, there's that name again, and Lee Harvey Oswald were there. If this information had come out during a trial, this is some of that information that if you remember, there was a garrison group that had been established back in Washington at Langley to sabotage Garrison at every point. They'd infiltrated his office, rat fucked it from within. His important witnesses that he was going to call, they knew in advance because somebody on the inside had turned over the entire case to him. So they killed off the witnesses. And they knew he was going to try to prove a link between Shaw and the CIA. And so they just withheld all these documents. They had their lawyers helping the defense. And they just denied. So, the jury didn't have any choice. They had to acquit him. But even the jury, when they were polled later, were convinced that Shaw was involved in it and that he was CIA. They just didn't have any proof. This is why. Anyway, Clay Shaw, August 16th, 1974. This is 2 weeks after Victor Marchetti writes this or publishes this book and reveals that Shaw was CIA. 2 weeks later, Shaw dies of a, quote, heart attack, and his body was cremated without an autopsy. Jose Joaquin Sangenis Perdomo. I'm sure I mispronounced that. Another Cuban exile who worked at the CIA at the Bay of Pigs. I've got him circled here in red. He's another one of these plumbers. Remember, E. Howard Hunt was in charge of recruiting these plumbers. He brought all his anti-Castro buddies. They're all Cubans. By the way, in that picture, you should recognize the guy on the far right. That's Frank Sturgis. Anyway, this guy's codenamed Felix while he worked with Watergate plumbers E. Howard Hunt and Bernard Barker. He was awarded the secret Merit Medal in 72 by the CIA. Right, he's CIA through and through. And he died of unknown causes in 1974. I included him in this list because he was involved with E. Howard Hunt and Bernard Barker. He was one of these guys that inevitably would have been called to testify about the times that he worked with Howard Hunt, Bernard Barker. I'm sure he had access to information that would have been damaging. Anyway, conveniently, he died in 1974 of unknown causes. There's another Cuban exile employed by the CIA. He also worked with E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, and Bernard Barker. He was killed October 5th, 1975, when his car exploded and blew his body to little bits. I wanted to include this story about Martha Mitchell. This is John Mitchell's wife. In the picture here, John Mitchell's on the far right. That's her husband. And this is Martha on the left. And I had heard all kinds of things about Martha Mitchell. I read the book by John Mitchell, and everything I'd ever heard, the public narrative I had ever heard about Martha Mitchell was that she was a dingbat, kind of crazy. And so for a long time, I didn't even pursue this. But I think it's worth mentioning because I'm starting to see a pattern with women who have damaging information, incriminating information. I'm starting to see a pattern how they're dealt with. It's one of the reasons why I put so much credence now in these women who come forward and who have been sheep dipped as crazy people. It's a very misogynistic tactic, but it works. It's an effective strategy to use against women. Women who might hurt you with their testimony. So let me just tell you this story, and then I'll draw a few conclusions at the end. All right, she's the estranged wife, which means they were separated from John Mitchell. They got separated after the Watergate. 5 days after the burglary, Martha told a reporter on the phone. We found out who that reporter was. Her name was Helen Hunt. She'll come up again in a minute. That she would leave her husband if he didn't quit the, quote, dirty business of politics. She was very distraught about what her husband had been involved in. And we're going to see in a minute how she knew. This wasn't just some ditzy wife who was clueless. She knew. And of course, we've already seen what John Mitchell was doing, extorting all these big companies, funneling all these cash bribes into Nixon's slush fund, ordering, he's the chairman of the creep. So ostensibly, he's the guy giving the plumbers all their orders. This guy was corrupt. Anyway, during the phone call with Helen Hunt, she was accosted. This is why we know it's true. Helen Hunt heard the whole thing. She was accosted by who we now know was former FBI agent Steve King. At the time, Helen didn't know who it was. Martha Mitchell revealed this later. She was accosted by this guy, tranquilized and held captive for several days. The reporter, Helen Hunt, heard Martha scream, "You just get away, get away." And then the line went dead. All right, let's follow this story forward. According to Kate Clark LeMay, pictured here, she's a historian at Washington's Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. So this is someone who deals with history and she understands the threshold one must meet to be able to document something, to be able to say something is true. You've got to have evidence. She said, quote, Martha Mitchell was kidnapped, sedated, drugged. People denied that this happened to her. In today's phrase, they gaslit her. They called her crazy. They use that age-old reference for women as hysterical. She was the whistleblower, and we respect her today. Garrett Graff, who just recently published a book called Watergate, A New History, appearing here on C-SPAN, says, quote, Martha Mitchell is one of the most significant figures of the Watergate age and has been largely lost to history for most of the intervening 50 years. She was, in many ways, the first conservative political pundit, the forerunner of outspoken voices like Rush Limbaugh or Sarah Palin. During the Nixon administration, she was the second most in-demand figure for Republican events after the president himself, and was this larger-than-life, colorful, outspoken woman in Washington at a time when most cabinet wives were seen, not heard. This is a picture, the top picture there is Helen Hunt. I'm sorry, her name is Helen Thomas. I don't know why I've got Hunt on the brain. Sorry, Helen Thomas. She worked for United Press International, UPI. She was friends with Martha Mitchell. Anyway, Mitchell, I told you I'd tell you how Mitchell knew all this. Mitchell came to know key details about Watergate because she eavesdropped on her husband. She listened to his phone calls. She also listened in on his meetings, and she looked through his papers. So she was nosy, and she wanted to know what her husband was up to. I can imagine a scenario where any wife would do this when they suspect their husband might be up to something. They're trying to find out the truth. That's what she did. Anyway, after the burglary, she phoned Helen Thomas to tell her what she knew, but that's when the altercation happened. And that is a picture of ex-FBI agent Steve King. King actually jerked the phone cord right out of the wall. And when Thomas called back, she was told by a switchboard operator that Mitchell was, quote, indisposed and unable to talk, which corroborates Mitchell's story and what Helen Thomas heard on the phone, obviously. According to Mitchell, she later, and this is a picture of Helen Thomas on the left on her wedding day. She's getting married to the man in the middle, and Martha Mitchell on the right. So you can see they're friends, close friends. Martha later accused King of assaulting, kidnapping, and sedating her. While she was being assaulted, she fought back, she smashed a window and had to get stitches. She says that 5 men held her down on a bed and a doctor injected her with a tranquilizer. We have corroboration of this. In 1975, James McCord admitted, quote, basically the woman was kidnapped. Later, when she returned to Washington, she told Thomas, she says, I'm black and blue. They don't want me to talk. According to Graff, you remember he's the author of this book, and he says, quote, polite Washington shrugged and saw her as this figure worthy of ridicule, not sympathy, and so she was not taken seriously in either her allegations about her own treatment about her warnings about the behavior of the Nixon administration writ large and the Nixon campaign specifically. Her husband basically told everyone that she was mentally unwell. This is coming from her husband, and an alcoholic, and not to put too much stock in her. She was one of the first voices to try to warn the country about the corruption at the center of the Nixon administration, and she was laughed at. You can see here an article, and you know, it's a pretty effective strategy, especially back then in the 70s, for the husband to dismiss you as an alcoholic and as crazy. And he said she was mentally unwell. And, you know, the drugging and then the story she's telling seems so fantastic. And people just dismissed her. Sally Quinn, a more contemporary writer, author, journalist, said, quote, they had to figure out a way to deal with her. So what they did was they said she was crazy. She wasn't crazy. It turns out because she was right, they locked her in a room, they kidnapped her. When they did what they did to her, you realize she wasn't crazy at all. She's an absolute tragedy. One of the Washington people who ended up being just ground up and spat out. And she had a tragic ending. She wasn't crazy. She was brave. She called it like she saw it, and she paid for it. Martha Mitchell died of cancer in 76. She was 57. How many of these witnesses died of cancer? There is a movie coming out called Gaslit, and you can see here it's scheduled to come out April 19th. And it is the story of Martha Mitchell. It might be something worth checking out. I know I'm going to. The reason I tell this story, I include this story, is because it fits a pattern. If you remember the story of Rose Cheramy, she was the prostitute who had inside information and predicted that JFK was going to be killed before it happened. She ended up in that same mental hospital in Jackson, Louisiana, that Oswald, Shaw, and Ferry had visited to give the cancer injections to the 3 Angola prison inmates at the end of the summer of 63. The same hospital that Oswald and Judith Very visited 2 days later to see if the injections had taken. That's where Rose Cheramy was taken. And of course, everybody said she was crazy and that she was a prostitute. And so her statement was dismissed. How about Dorothy Kilgallen? Another person who claimed to have inside information from a source, Jack Ruby, who she had met with. Wasn't a long interview, but it was an interview nobody else got. And according to her, in that interview, Jack Ruby had given her the name of a very important man in New Orleans, that if she talked to him, it would solve the entire case. She was right on the verge of publishing her book when she was killed. And what do you hear about Dorothy Kilgallen? Her marriage was falling apart. She was on drugs. She was an alcoholic. It's all the same BS. They always do this to the women. How about Mary Pinchot Meyer, who had an affair with JFK, the wife of Cordmeyer? Cordmeyer, whom E. Howard Hunt said was intricately involved with Bill Harvey in the planning of the JFK assassination, whom we're going to find out later was completely in charge of Operation Mockingbird. This is his wife. She was having an affair with JFK. And she got into drugs with Timothy Leary. She did drugs with JFK in bed. Her dream was to have a party where JFK and Khrushchev were both there, and they'd both do drugs together, LSD, and become peaceniks and bring peace to the world. She was shot on a walking trail in Washington, D.C., and the crime was never solved. They blame it on a black man. And then when her relatives went to her house, who was there in her house, had broken in, was rummaging through all her things? It was Angleton, James Jesus Angleton, the head of counterintelligence at the CIA. When they went to her studio where she kept her artwork, he was trying to pick the lock to get in that. What do they say about Mary Pinchot Meyer? She was a drugged up, crazy lady. How about Judith Mary Baker? Every time I even bring her up, the vitriol it causes. They say she's crazy. They say she makes up stuff. I can get into all the stuff they say about Judith Mary Baker. Who is Judith Mary Baker? The woman who claims to be Lee Harvey Oswald's girlfriend. that summer of 63, who has all kinds of specific details about Oswald when he was involved in that summer of 63, all of it corroborated. Who was with him when they went to Jackson to test the prisoners to see if the cancer drug took? Who had multiple phone conversations with him as his time on Earth wound down in Dallas, and can provide all kinds of inside perspective on what Oswald really knew and what he was trying to do. Who was a genius when it comes to medicine, was drummed out of the profession by Alton Ochsner, was roped into that project as an 18, 19-year-old naive girl, has lost everything. She's lost her husband, she's lost her family, she's lost her life's work, she's lost everything. And people criticize her and say, well, she comes off as high-strung and stressed. Well, you'd be high-strung and stressed out too if people are trying to kill you. She lives on 30-day visas, traveling from European country to European country, one step ahead of the posse. She is a little strange. Interview her, listen to an interview. She's very hard to follow. And I think she's just exhausted. But they've said all the same things about Judith Vary Baker they say about all these women. And there's others. These are just the ones that popped into my head. They did the same thing to Martha Mitchell. So when people say, well, if it was a conspiracy to kill JFK, people would have talked. People did talk. People tried to talk. They got killed for it, or they got their lives destroyed, or they got called crazy. It's funny, people will talk. They'll come out and say things. And there is such a resistance to the truth that people will attack the person who's doing the talking. They become the enemy. So anyway, I'm going to check out that movie. I think that might be worth my time. Okay, so that concludes the Watergate investigation. And I hope this was interesting. It was interesting to me. Every time I go back over this, it's just mind-blowing to me, the chronology of all these important witnesses. And of course, I could have included more, but I'm trying to keep this, reasonably short. I know I went long today, but there are others. And so I just want to show a pattern. There's always collateral damage with all these investigations. And how many of those deaths were ruled unknown causes? Cancer, unexplained. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. How many of those bodies did not receive an autopsy? Seems to be a pattern. Remember, dead men tell no tales. Okay, check out my website, sphistory.com, and feel free to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Hit the notification bell, thumbs up. Tomorrow we will begin the next investigation number 4, which is the church hearings. Technically, it's not called the church hearings, but that's how it's come to be known. And we will begin looking at this investigation into the CIA and the FBI, the intelligence community, and all the shenanigans that came out as a result of Watergate that people wanted to pursue and follow up on. So that's another positive outcome, by the way, of the Watergate investigation. A closer look at the CIA and the FBI. What have they been up to in our name? Okay, until next time, I appreciate you all tuning in. I'm going to go watch our boys play basketball and see how they do. Hopefully they win. And I will see you tomorrow. Thank you. Have a good day.